Hello and welcome everyone. We're just a couple minutes away from the top of the hour when we'll officially get started. But in the meantime, feel free to type into the chat box, say hi, where you're from, and we're glad you're here. Lots of people logging on as we speak, and we're going to get going momentarily. So hopefully your speakers are working, and I tested our mic, so I know it's working, and we're ready to go.
From PEI, hello, Aaron Smith.
Hey, Aaron, thanks for joining
our executive
us.
chef
Awesome.
from PEI. When we can travel, it will be the first place we go.
Yes, absolutely. Awesome. And we have a birthday girl. At least she registered. I don't know if she's logged on yet, but we want to wish happy birthday to Jody when she gets here. So yeah, I just took a quick look at the participant list before we logged on, and wow, what an impressive group of people. Really looking forward to today. It's top of the hour. An official hello and welcome everyone. I'm David Cory with the EITC.
And I'm Jill Cory with the EITC. Welcome. We just want to say before we get too far into it that these are difficult times, and as many people have noted, unprecedented times for us in terms of not just social distance, but isolation, recognizing the most vulnerable people are at most risk and in some ways further away from us and our ability to help than they've ever been. And that you'll have your own reasons for joining us, whether you're just looking for a distraction or some community to be part of, or, you know, we understand that the topic is generally of interest, but it's interesting in these difficult times that things take different priorities, and what mattered 3 weeks ago matters a little less right now in these times. So we just want to really recognize that, and we'd like to hear from all of you about what you're struggling with and why you're here today.
Yeah, so use the chat box and type in your greetings, your questions, etc. We'll do a quick poll here just to find out a bit more about what brought you here today. So feel free to select a response. What brought you here today? I know that some of you, for some of you, gender is a specialty area. EI is a specialty area for several of you. I know that, and for some of you, EI and gender is actually a specialty area. So we're just curious and interested, and if it's something that you don't see listed there, please feel free to type that into the chat box, and we'll read that out, and we'll take a look.
Yeah, we won't be offended if you say bored because I'm stuck at home.
That was really more to get a smile out of people. Okay, very few people are bored because they're stuck at home.
I'm using my quarantine time well to catch up.
Excellent.
Good. Yeah.
Excellent.
Yeah, there are, it's interesting, you know, not to silver line this too much, but it is interesting what opportunities are being offered to us during these times. Certainly our environment is a little happier right now to have less being pumped into its system, and I think in general humanity is taking a deep breath as well. Unfortunately, we can't breathe too deeply because of the worry for people around us, but yeah, I think that there are some opportunities here for each of us to gather ourselves in different ways.
I can't remember whether you can read what's been typed into the chat box, or whether it's just us that can read what's typed into the chat box. So certainly, so if someone could let us know whether you can read everything that's being typed in. Well, you can all read it. Okay, excellent, awesome. So yeah, hi Lori from 20 years ago at the Open Learning Agency. That's so awesome. So great that you could join us, and Paul from Nova Scotia, from Halifax, I believe, and
there's
Zena.
Jody. Hi, Jody. So we did say happy birthday to you. Not sure if you were there at the time.
Happy birthday, Jody. Yeah. And Zena from Montreal. Yeah, wonderful to see all of you folks joining us today. Thank you. All right, let's end the poll. first of all, I'll just read the poll to you. So we've got 7% of you said gender is a specialty area, 20% said EI is, and 67% said generally interested. So we'll go with that.
Is this session for all ages of gender? I would say so. It's a fairly high-level overview. We're, yeah, for sure, and all genders, yes.
Yeah, thanks for the questions, and we'll get going. And hi, Michelle in Vancouver. Yeah, so what do we mean by gender? This is a great question.
This is really what we're going to cover off today. So a little bit, I mean, again, very high level. There's so much that's interesting in the literature. I've been a feminist, and I've worked in women's health in the area of violence against women. My graduate work was in sociology and in gender studies. So we're going to give you a light touch on all of this, but we just want to bring some of that to the EQI and ask some of the questions that we've been asking ourselves and how we've been using it. So what do we mean by gender? We're going to look at some widely held beliefs about gender, maybe have a little bit of a giggle about some of that, and look at some of the impacts of gender bias. But more importantly, we want to get to EQI and gender, look a little bit at the research again, not maybe what you would expect that we're going to do here, and look at a little bit of our experience in using the EQI assessment, and then open it up for questions. So that's what we're going to do today.
What I think is interesting about this is that we've been having these conversations for 36 years. And I'm happy to share some of my experiences as being a fairly typical male who didn't know anything about feminism until I met a feminist and learned what feminism was, and took gender studies when it was called women's studies at the University of Calgary, and studied some of the feminist literature, and really came to grow an appreciation as my understanding grew. So we hope to share some of that with you, and let's start by jumping into looking at what we mean by and really why we're talking about this today is because gender still matters.
Yeah.
In 2020.
Yeah. And we did have to say why gender, like why does it still matter at this point? And we just have to look around to schools, to bathrooms, to people saying good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. There are so many ways in which we continue to categorize and sort people by gender as the top method. And of course, we are not in any way leaving out the other ways that we sort people by race, ethnicity, culture, age. As I get older, that becomes a little more important to me. So we recognize that there's an intersectionality, but today we're just going to have a sort of a pinpoint look at gender. And we do recognize that it is the most pervasive and persistent category, social and cultural category.
And this idea that it's so embedded, it can seem inherent.
Right.
And so we talk about characteristics of men and women as if they are somehow inherent to the fact that people are either men or women. And we'll be talking a lot about the binary today because we still live with the binary, and yes, it's changing, and yeah, in the future you'll talk about the binary a lot less, but we still find ourselves, in fact, many take for example the EQI, the only two categories that you could select if you wanted to use sex as a norm is male or female. So we're still talking about men and women, and in the future we'll talk about it less, I suppose.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. So, and I think the other thing about it being inherent is sometimes we forget that it's socially constructed rather than anatomical. So I think that's the other thing about embedded, and certainly grateful to other communities of gender who are bringing to attention that not only is it not a binary, but it's not a natural born state, that we all have identities that are potentially different than our anatomy. So as a result of this, we make lots of gender attribution errors. And by that we mean that we associate behaviors with gender rather than with natural characteristics. And because we can't isolate people, well, we kind of are right now, maybe it's a good time to do some research. We can't isolate people from their social environment. So we will likely never really know, really deeply know that people are who they are because of gender socialization or because of what they were born as and who they become. So we make lots of errors. We'll talk about this a little later, but it's like when somebody drives fast past me, I might say, oh, it's a young kid, right? Like so I generalize, and it's potentially an attribution error. It was just that person that was driving fast. And
Right.
same with like a young man, right? Might say that. And the result of that is that we limit people. We start early streaming kids into their strengths. We set them up to be certain things. You know, boys are strong, girls are adorable from babyhood. And even though we recognize a lot of that is changing, a lot of that is still persists in the kind of toys that are marketed to children, to the kinds of clothing and styles of men and women. So yeah, so they're limiting. They limit us as humans and our capacities.
Okay, let's tackle the idea of sex, gender, and identity first and foremost, and all of those symbols that you see on the screen there, those all represent a gender identity, and there are many, and of course they're fluid. So I guess we want to start off with some definitions. So sex frequently assigned at birth, or well, of course, before, if you look at
right, yeah. Wow, we just dated ourselves.
Yeah. So and again, there's some challenge here as well. What if what if a baby's born with only parts, partially formed genitals? Then there's a challenge there.
Yeah, and so almost immediately we leap from assignment of anatomy into social constructions of identity based on gender. So there's a quick shift almost immediately. It's not a healthy child that's born, it's a boy or a girl. And immediately we start to attribute characteristics and qualities to that newborn.
Yeah, and we had to really think hard about this when several years ago now, we went on holiday and met a couple that were not gendering their baby, and that was a foreign concept to us. We had to really struggle with the concept, and the more we thought about it, the more they were really giving that baby a chance to be what it wanted to be, what they wanted to be, and so really came to appreciate that idea much more.
Yeah, and our culture really very much resists that. Really resists that. It's like we feel uncomfortable when we don't know, when we can't assign gender to a person. So I think we're only pointing here to how much we hang our social interactions on understanding gender identity.
And in some cultures, it's much more rigid, strict than in others, and so part of that is cultural. And then there's this idea of gender as an internal sense. That now, as we're learning much more about people who are transgendered, that this internal sense that they may be different somehow than what the sex they were assigned at birth, and so we are moving away from the idea of the binary.
And still, we are kind of stuck with the binary. Even people who are trying not to identify are still like not identifying with the binary. So it's going to be a category that persists, and despite our best efforts to dismantle it for now.
Mm-hmm.
So that's a quick overview of some of the language and some of the ways in which we are trying to understand gender and its how it emerges and how it's used in our culture.
Mm-hmm. So how do we participate in this? Well, we constantly reinforce this.
Okay, but seriously, is that the most adorable picture? But there it is, right? There's gender.
Yeah, and you know, I hope you have realized or noticed that this is about unconscious bias. That our brains look for shortcuts, and so how can we take shortcuts around the idea of gender? And so you know, we look for, okay, so what color would be a suitable color for a boy, and what colors would be suitable for a girl, and we just have that. Well, we've learned it, right? We've learned it. If you really think about it, why would blue just be the color for a boy?
And again, Dave referenced culture in the previous slide, and culturally those symbols are different. So we have our set of social symbols that signal gender: pronouns, appearance, clothing, behaviors, voice, traits, interests. They signal to us gender. And when there's dissonance between the trait or the interest and the gender, it does create dissonance when there's because we have an expectation of these behaviors aligning with the gender assignment. So again, we're making broad generalizations here because we're trying to stay high level and not get into too much detail, but we're pointing to things that we can sometimes take as natural ways of being in the world, and both highlighting them and then asking us how we're resisting falling into that ourselves in a gender bias or unconscious bias way.
Yeah, how can we be critical about these things?
Yes. So we are creating this narrative of gender and gender expectations, and this is, as probably all of you have been engaged in, part of the kind of move to resist this conversation. And I'll tell you, as a feminist who has lived in the category of women for a long time, it's an important challenge for all of us to see where we're right about that and where we need to all make changes.
Mm-hmm.
Mm-hmm. And stay connected to how people are living in gender and gender dissonance. So we went to the literature, of course, just to see what people are still saying about femininity and masculinity. And all of these were words that came up: tender, warm, modest, empathetic, socially responsible, collaborative, indecisive, caregiver, emotional, cries easily. And we could all, if we were really having fun with this, add to that list, because we know the association between gender and qualities or characteristics. But this was one of many. I consider them training grounds for women, like how to be a woman,
how to be an attractive goddess.
Yeah, how to be. They didn't have the internet when I was growing up, so I missed some chapters in the development.
So really, why we want to point out this idea of femininity is to really talk about the continuum, that masculinity and femininity are social constructions that are on a continuum, and so this would be one end, and this would be the other, where we've got this guy, he's assertive, he's tough, he's strong, he's decisive, he's detached, he's distant, he's focused on success, he's the breadwinner, he doesn't cry or show weakness or even have any emotions, and that's the other extreme. And how are we supposed to have deep intimate relationships when we're trying to be these things which are so distant from each other? How do we get together?
And what we know is that most people don't identify with these kind of extreme normative behaviors of gender, and so a lot of us feel like, well, we don't fit the stereotype, and that's true. Most of us don't fit the stereotype, but still the stereotype persists, and it's fascinating. Mm-hmm. So instead of feeling abnormal or out of step, what we're saying is that we're all living in this gender continuum of qualities and traits and interests, and certainly in this last decade, maybe the last decade, that's been blown up even more in terms of expectations, and yet the stats still show that women do poorly in so many areas of leadership. Violence against women is growing, not decreasing. So we know that by gender, there are still some disturbing facts. Poverty is much more associated with women and their children. So still in lots of vulnerability scales, women are not doing as well. So it's still a relevant category.
Mm-hmm.
And yet, as an individual, what are the limitations and what can we do about that? That's kind of our question.
Absolutely. And so we do end up stereotyping people by gender. This is a photo of an airline in Saudi Arabia, which is training women pilots. And I thought it was interesting because, of course, Saudi Arabia has only recently allowed women to drive cars. So interesting that these things are evolving, and we're changing our mind about that restrictive lens of gender. But it still leads to perception and attribution errors. I was telling Jill that one day I was getting on the plane and I noticed in the cockpit that there were two women flying the plane, pilot and first officer, and it was a natural, normal reaction for me to wonder how that was going to go. And then I talked for a fraction of a second, quickly talked myself out of it. Of course, they can fly planes, but it's funny how it catches us off guard.
Yeah, Dave was saying he did a children's album 20 years ago.
Yeah.
And
yeah. So in my kids song, I talked about a firefighter who turns out by the end of the verse to be a woman, a pilot who turns out to be a woman, a daycare worker who turns out to be a man, and it's so interesting that would have less impact now, less shock value. 20 years ago, it caught people off guard, and they were expecting to hear about the gender that was more appropriate or conformed to that particular occupation or profession. But so we are evolving, I guess, is the good news.
I think the other thing that we were thinking about as we looked at this photo is how do we attribute, what are we attributing when we see it? Not just that's not the gender role, but do we have questions like, am I safe? Am I safe with a physician who's not my gender? What if the mechanic is a woman? Is she going to do a good enough job? What if a caregiver is a male? Does he know how to be a nurse? So we still have these, I guess, dissonant moments. And of course, we have rational thought that can follow it, just as Dave described. But we still have like our first moment of dissonance or worry about, what probably competency is the question. Right, Dave jokingly said, "What if your navigator is a woman?" And he was pointing to me because I'm a terrible navigator, and that's a personal quality, not a gender quality. But you see again how you can conflate an individual quality with a gender quality when it conforms. Yeah.
And just one other observation is. This notion of how do we come to be this way. So I was thinking that today's young people don't necessarily have the same experiences in terms of working with tools, for example. I was just thinking about this. So my father taught me how to use tools because he came from the farm, moved to the city, and now the younger generations are more urban in nature and are less likely, boys and girls, to learn how to use tools. And so that's just
girls
kind of
feel less. So at first Dave said our parents came from the farm and taught us to use tools, and I'm like, no, they came from the farm and taught boys to use tools.
They did.
Right, and so again, there's just the ways that they show up. Dave was also, when we were talking about all this, what if your husband offers to cook dinner? Are you looking forward to it or not?
It's like the kids who make the meal for a mother on Mother's Day. You're really looking forward to that meal? It's a sweet sentiment.
Right. And then what if your partner's an excellent cook, which we know lots of men are.
Absolutely.
And so that's the thing that's so interesting is we think it's funny because it breaches the notion of what belongs to what gender. And so what if he's an excellent cook? And then what does that stir up in us when we want to come to the defense of somebody who's being maligned from a gender perspective? In the area of violence against women, one of the shocking things for me is always when women in the room want to defend men who are abusive, because their allegiance to men, their identity with men is so strong that they can't see how gender and power and impact connect. And I'm not sure if I'm really making that point clearly, but it is just an interesting, like women want to say not all men are like that, and I would never say that they were, but there's a way in which it's interesting when we come to the defense of gender rather than trying to stay open to what's happening within that gender and who's responsible for it. And yeah, so I won't say any more unless you want.
Human beings always defy stereotypes, and I guess that's the thing. And kind of one of our messages here today is that we gender influences EQ to some extent, and yet there are always exceptions. So what may be true for thousands is not true for you is kind of a way of thinking about statistics and the fact that there are always people who don't conform to the stereotype.
Right. So this last, I'll just make a quick comment. The harmful stereotypes can be both hostile or negative, like women are irrational or all men are interested in power. So they can be harmful stereotypes, or they can be sort of benign. Women are nurturing, or men are breadwinners, or like men are better at fixing cars. So they don't all have to be harmful, but the harm in all of them is that they limit the potential for people.
Thanks, Zena. I was brought up to believe girls should be teachers, nurses, and secretaries.
Right.
Absolutely, as were many of us.
Yeah.
Let's go on and look at this idea of attribution error. Jill, you want to go over the cartoon? It's a great cartoon.
Yeah, so there's two boys at the blackboard doing math, and the one on the right makes a mistake, and the one on the left says, "Wow, you suck at math." So it's a direct, like, that person isn't good at math, whereas the other one is a girl and a boy together, and she makes a mistake, and the boy says, "Wow, girls suck at math." And so that's the difference between attributing it to a personal, fault or error versus attributing it to gender. And we do that also with race, we do that with ethnicity, we do that with age. So it's not the only way that we do make attribution errors, but in gender, that's one of the ways. Like women aren't good at being leaders when times require a heavy hand, or like we have lots of generalizations that are really just attribution error. And these are outdated constructs that we still lean heavily on to explain our world and explain people's behaviors and motives and intentions. But we are trying to push towards, not David and I, but the world, I think, lots of us, all of you on the line with us, trying to create this continuum of feminine and masculine and allow people to have an identity, not based on gender, but on interests and attributions, attributes. And
we're still so heavily influenced by traditional beliefs.
Yeah.
Okay. This idea of inherent differences, it used to be a much bigger deal. People wanted to explain gender differences by biology, and then they went looking for evidence, and they found it. They found differences in terms of how the brain's neural connections. But what we don't know are about those neural connections. And now the criticism is, have we socialized those developing brains so that they develop that difference in those neural connections? And Lisa Elliott wrote this book, Pink Brain, Blue Brain, where she says, and I love this line, the brain is a unisex organ. Human brains are not sexually dimorphic. And I had to look that word up because I liked it, dimorphic. And really it's a biology term, which is about about sex differences. And something is sexually dimorphic when it's a difference beyond a reproductive difference between the sexes of a species. And so then in the comment section where she tweeted, or somebody tweeted this, a geneticist said, genes are also sexually dimorphic. So the basis of life is not sexually dimorphic. And so this is not what makes us men and women, neither do our brains. Interesting.
Interesting. So we just say research is all over the map, and we're not really going to review it. There's lots online. We did look at one study that suggested that they went back and looked at 13 major studies on gender, and that found gender differences, and actually in the end decided that they had overstated the gender differences and that there was much more in the realm of similarity than difference. So I think as gender is challenged more as a construct, our research is going to get a little bit more connected to less to ideology and more to the, science. I say science, it's a social science, because we will never know. It cannot be an exact science beyond genes and brain function. How much is socialization? But I think that the research
can't really do those experiments.
Right.
It's
yeah, the research
unethical.
is emerging in more important and more helpful ways for us, I think, to deconstruct gender.
Yeah. And then Jill, you found this this study that talked about the big 5 personality traits. And I like that they spell ocean, so you can always remember them. So you're probably familiar with the big 5: openness, conscientiousness, extroversion, agreeableness, and neuroticism. And we think it's interesting that these do not categorically vary between women and men. So there is no statistical difference between men and women on the big 5 personality traits. And so this has been found in other studies. You found one that compared 127 different.
Yeah, 122 different qualities and traits.
Yeah.
And that there was no statistically significant difference between gender.
Okay, so where are we going with this? Well, we're going to impacts, and I chose this photograph of Brenda Lucki, who you may recognize as the new commissioner of the RCMP here in Canada, and the gender stereotyping limits men and women, and then people who want to sort of counter that or say that how could that be if we've got women in powerful positions of leadership like Brenda Lucki? How could that be? And we just want to say that there are far more instances of the other, which are less reported and less in the news and less in the public eye. And these result in, for example, you may know, it's public knowledge, there are 2 class action suits, one by women who feel that they were mistreated by the military, so one against the Department of National Defense and the other against the RCMP. So that's kind of, we can't ignore that kind of evidence.
Yeah, and also I guess there's always some question about why Brenda Lucki is in this position. Is it a corrective or remedial move to put a new face on against the class action suit? So
we'll never really know.
We won't know, but I think that's the other really tragic thing about when gender is involved, is the question about whether women in particular got there because they deserved it or because there were equity movements or agendas that hired them. I think the other thing to point to as one of our kind of cultural experiences is Hillary Clinton, and how she was never a candidate, she was a woman candidate, and how gender became so highlighted in that campaign. And then all the criticisms as we all know them, what she wore, how she looked tired, what her hair looked like all that narrative that was about her qualities and traits as a woman, not as a leader. I heard her interviewed again the other day, and she's absolutely brilliant, and I think it was a tragic and strategic use of gender in that campaign to to leave her out, and one that the conservative side really leaned heavily on. So yeah, so it can be, the impacts of stereotyping can be far reaching. We've got just one example on the next slide.
Yeah, let's look at some more
in terms of leadership
evidence.
Yeah. So 1/3 of global businesses had no women in senior management, and that's not changed since 2011. And I think this is a 2018 study. At this rate of change, women will not reach parity with men until 2060. Another study that showed women held under 24% of senior roles across the world in 2016, which is only a 3% increase from 2011. Sorry, that was a 2016 study, both of these from the same. So there's lots of statistics and lots of evidence of gender lack of parity or inequities. And we know, again, that that's one of the deeply tragic impacts of gender stereotyping.
Yeah, just
is association with lack of competence.
Yeah, absolutely. Just think about that for a moment. At this rate of change, women will not reach parity with men until 2060. That just
long past my fight is over.
that just it's appalling, really.
Mm-hmm.
It's absolutely appalling. Oh, okay. So where do we go from here? Well, we want to quickly review, and for those of you who aren't familiar with this model, talk about this model for a moment, and then look at EQ. So this model, as you may know, is a model of emotional intelligence, one of the most widely accepted models for use in coaching and development of people, because it consists of 15 skills, all of which can be improved. And they are divided up into 5 categories: self-perception, self-expression, interpersonal decision-making, and stress management. It's the basis for the emotional quotient inventory, which we use in our coaching with managers. Anything else we want to say about the model, Jill?
No, I think what we like about the model is that these are all, as Dave said, teachable skills. So it's an excellent development tool, and yeah.
Okay.
So they are not fixed. This is not personality. These are not fixed traits or tendencies. This is just contextually skills that have or haven't been as developed as they could be.
Yeah, and I guess just quickly, this idea of how we perceive ourselves, whether we perceive ourselves as competent and confident and belonging, etc. You can just so quickly and easily see how gender would play a role in that. If you don't see yourself in that in popular culture and the media as taking an active role, as being the actor, the one who does the fun stuff, that may not be an aspiration of yours. And so we have to have role models for
competence and opportunity.
Yeah, for all genders.
Yeah.
So right away, and then self-expression. We want to get to look at some actual case studies. But first of all, who do you think rates themselves higher on the EQI on self-regard? I'm going to introduce a quick poll for you here. So let's take a look at this. We want to take a look at the next poll is poll 2. Whoops, poll 3.
No, we don't have one on this one. Sorry. Just write your comments in if you would.
Yeah. In any case, now what's going on? So we asked who thinks that men rate themselves higher than on the EQI and self-regard. And Patricia, you're absolutely right. Men do rate themselves higher on self-regard, and there's a couple of studies. One was the MHS norming study, and the other was Blydorn et al. In 2015, who looked at these statistics and found that. And if you think about why that is, again, talking about the pop culture and the media and seeing yourself in various roles, etc. and or standards that we have to meet appearance-wise in order to feel good about ourselves and to accept ourselves for who we are. So there's again lots of socialization reasons.
But isn't it in the 360? Isn't there another stat? Isn't it there that others rate women?
Yeah. So the 360 norming process found that all raters rate women higher on everything, and so even self-regard. So that's interesting. Paul says culture would be a big influencer too. Absolutely, Paul. Culture is a big influencer in terms of how you perceive yourself and whether you're okay with yourself the way you are. Then you found some more recent research.
Yeah, well, it was from, to your point, Paul, of culture. It was a study that was conducted in India and actually found that women were rating themselves higher in self-regard than men. And that was a 2017 study. So I think there's some changing perceptions about that. And when we say men, of course, it is interesting that, one of the things that we think about self-regard or anything that attached to self is that we're responsible for it ourselves, but everything self is always in, even in today's social distancing world. And I think even the social distancing is making us so aware of how in community we always are. But self-regard is a social construct, and we only know ourselves through the eyes and behaviors and messages of others. So self-perception in general, but self-regard specifically, is developed through connection with other people and messages from other people. So women often, the perception of women is often that they are somehow flawed and never enough, and we set impossible standards and expectations for women. So I do a women's leadership course, and it's not that women all have low self-regard scores, but they all struggle with the idea that they're never enough, that they're so busy and so pulled and juggling so much that they never feel like they're accomplishing or finishing or excelling in one area because they're doing the 24-hour shift or double shift at least. And so I think there are lots of ways in which self-regard, we need to pay attention to the social effects of women's self-regard.
And Michelle added, organizational workplace culture can also impact how self-regard is rated and expressed. Yeah, totally, Michelle.
Yeah,
absolutely.
Yeah, and I'm glad you used the word impact. I think that's our point, is that these are not constructed within ourselves. Like somehow we take ideas, which I think we need to critique deeply, notions like self-esteem, and treat them as if they're just internal processes, and they're not. They are so socially developed and eroded. Yeah.
Let's look at who asks for things more, and a quick poll, and that one is this one here.
No. Who has the higher assertiveness?
Yeah, so who do you think has the higher assertiveness? Just check which one you think should go there. Higher assertiveness.
Yeah.
Okay, so we have some people typing in as well as people answering the poll. Yeah, so kind of interesting, but the majority of you said that it is men, and we have a study to point to, which is kind of an interesting study, which is that men ask for things like raises, special consideration in negotiations, and ask for promotions 3 times more than women, and so again, socially acceptable.
Yes. And yet, men do not ask for help or for direction.
Yeah, we had a good
so
one.
I guess it depends on what we think of as assertive.
Because that would be a sign of weakness.
Yeah.
And we men do not like to show signs of weakness. Yeah. That's not part of the code.
Okay, so now you're getting a picture. I'm a poor navigator. Dave doesn't ask for help, so you can see how often we get lost. Also, we've noticed in our training when we do co-ed men and women training together, that men equally have trouble having difficult conversations. which is often the basis. The skill is around assertiveness and saying what's okay and not okay. But the context of gender is interesting. We would postulate that women avoid or try to avoid having difficult conversations because of empathy for the other person, and sometimes because of power differences, whereas men avoid it because they don't want to appear that they don't know the answer, or that there's been some problem in their behavior. That's what, we've got some laughs on the screen here. So, yeah, so don't follow us, that's all we're saying.
So we thought it is also interesting. We have other research to demonstrate or support the fact that women rate themselves higher in the interpersonal area, and women score higher than men in this composite area, suggesting that women have more effective relationships. And you can argue in terms of leadership that that's important for direct reports and for peers and for more senior managers. You can argue that that this is important when you're asking people to follow you into a difficult situation or to address a difficult situation at work as well.
And more important as we shift towards these more collaborative leadership models.
Yes, absolutely.
Collaborative and connected models.
Yeah. Okay, so who scores higher on stress tolerance? Men or women? And that is this one here. And so who do you think scores higher on stress tolerance? Very quickly, give you a couple of seconds to... Oh, look at that. They're tied.
Yeah, you know, and really your answers are showing the kind of interesting nuances of this question.
It is, yeah. Because I didn't, in the polling question, I did not copy what was on the screen. Yeah, so who scores higher on stress tolerance on the EQI may be a different question than who has a higher stress tolerance. Okay, so thank you, everyone. So most of you did say women. Most of you said women, when in fact the answer to the question on the screen is, whoops, oh, we don't even have that particular slide, but men rate themselves higher on stress tolerance. So that's interesting.
Yeah.
And again, socialization, it's, male role models.
The meaning of not being able to handle stress lands differently as a man.
It's an admission of weakness, which we avoid at all costs, we men.
Okay, not that we're generalizing.
To grossly generalize. Okay, so this is interesting. Another research finding about stress and decision making, which talked about under stress, women become more cautious, whereas men take greater risks.
Who would you want to be making decisions? And this is linked to another EQ competency, which is impulse control, where I think, I don't know gender, but I think men score, well, higher, which is not necessarily better. Score lower on impulse control.
No, they don't statistically, but yeah, we meet lots of men who are more senior in organizations who do score lower on impulse control.
So when you put these together, that actually what this is pointing to is that women actually tolerate stress better because they stay more connected to the reality rather than using other things like taking charge and charging ahead. So. Yeah, it's interesting.
And then we couldn't help but try to understand the stress differences between men and women by this slide here. Do you want to?
Sure. And in our leadership courses, we do an exercise kind of looking at what people are juggling in their lives. And so on the left is a woman, of course, and she's very detailed in all that she's juggling. And it ranges from food preparation and planning to children's sports to all her work projects. And the question that we ask them is, put up high the things that are taking up a lot of your time and down below the things that are falling away or getting less of their attention. And you'll see that she also drew a heart there because that's kind of her center point. And so you can just see the detail of all that this woman is juggling. And then in our co-ed leadership mixed course, This is what a man is juggling: romance, family. Like there's no detail to it. Retirement planning, and then down below, golf has fallen off. One of his
Travel,
etc.
employees.
So yeah, so it's interesting. Hence the term man-child. Yes, thanks, Paul. Yeah, yeah. And so again, we're not trying to create this binary or polarity between genders, but you can't help but still notice how socialization has created us into these boxes that are limiting our opportunities and possibilities. And so we know the stereotype continues to exist, and it's our job to just get more attentive to it and try to create opportunities to develop outside that box.
Yeah, so just a bit of a summary before we take a look at some EQI scores. So individuals are a unique mix, and gender influences how we either develop or don't develop some of these competencies. Gender is an important lens, and then we have to take that into account when we're interpreting EQ scores and also the context.
When I first started with the company 5 years ago, I really wanted there to be statistically significant gender differences, because intuitively, that was my belief, and there are none. So what's important is that the way that we bring gender to the assessment is through this interpretation and context of results, not by statistical significance, but how people understand how this shows up in their lives.
It's not that there are none.
Yeah.
There are
Okay.
a couple of
Yeah,
I can't help it. In any case, we wanted to demonstrate some similar scores with distinct interpretations. The tool, the EQI, is context sensitive. So let's take a look then.
Yeah.
You want to speak to this first one, Jill?
Yeah. So what we tried to do is find a couple of assessments. The woman's is on the left and the man's is on the right. They have the same total EI score, and yet you can see how differently they are in terms of the individual competencies. And we're not interested in forcing a gender analysis. That's not the point here.
Yeah.
But the point is to allow for gender to be one of the ways that people explain how this competency is playing out or impacting them in their own lives. So this woman has high emotional self-awareness, which we would expect, and low emotional expression. And it's attached to low assertiveness. So she is someone who's not, feels not capable of saying what she needs. And
low independence.
And low independence, right? Which is depending on other people's perceptions rather than trusting her own. And so that's not an uncommon picture for a woman's EQI assessment. Whereas the man has very high scores on self-expression. And we postulate that possibly he shouldn't, because he has low self-awareness and yet feels still very entitled to speak up and speak out. And so you can see how these each of these individual scores become quite interesting as conversation. And gender doesn't we don't reference it explicitly, but we keep that as part of our understanding and part of our hope in helping. Like this man, we would want him to start to see how, we might not use the language of entitlement, but how there's some entitlement there in terms of being able to speak without awareness, right? And quite openly and be assertive and be independent, but yet have very little self-awareness. And part of that lack of self-awareness shows up in empathy and interpersonal relationships and not thinking about others. Whereas this woman is thinking way more about other people than herself.
Yes.
And that's not atypical, that we see women who are emotionally self-aware and then thinking deeply about other people and her impact on other people. So it's a good illustration of some of the differences. When we get down lower, there's maybe less stark differences between the scores, although, Dave, I can't see that. Reality testing, I think for women, what we, and again, not always, but women are more likely to ask for help. So reality testing is really just is about gathering information from others and from other sources. And so it's not just about objectivity. The way to have a more objective perspective is to gather more data, and men tend to be more, as you see, his score is high in independence, so it makes sense that it's also that he's lower in testing reality. In other words, asking other people for their views and input. And then the bottom scores, again, I can't, stress tolerance. So those of you who said women have higher stress tolerance, that in general is our experience. When women have high stress tolerance, it's because they've developed community and work more in collaboration. Oh, it's one thing we didn't say about independence. The upside of independence is often a reflection that they are more committed, people are more committed to working in teams than independently. So the opposite of independence isn't necessarily dependence. It can be a really positive quality of collaboration. And that's a really important one to take to a conversation. And that this notion of independence, actually, we're trying to challenge that with men who think that that's still the kind of leadership style that is important. And so men who work independently, it makes sense to us that there's a lower stress tolerance for him, because he doesn't work in a community that helps to mitigate some of the stresses of leadership. For example, this is a leadership report.
Absolutely. So we have a question: does reality testing imply how your decisions may impact others?
Absolutely.
Yeah, absolutely, Patricia. That's a good observation. Yeah, we want to make sure that we're testing our perceptions.
Yeah, and so high empathy scores often connected to reality testing because of that very point, that people are paying attention to the impact of not just decisions but actions or behaviors, and that they're checking them out. They don't just assume that I've made the decision, so people respect me, it'll be fine. Yeah.
So here's another comparison. Again, very similar total EI scores, and yet very different profiles. And so you can see here that we've got this man with a self-regard score of 112. The woman is at 92. The self-actualization, again, as Jill explained, women are often feeling like they're in their dream job, but they don't feel self-actualized because, again, of all the things on their plates and all the things they're responsible for, never feeling like they're doing any of those roles.
But this woman has high self-actualization.
No, this
sorry.
Sorry.
Okay,
yeah. So this woman is fairly high in emotional self-awareness, and the guy is fairly low in emotional self-awareness. And again, so some of these, I guess, the point that we wanted to make are some things are gender conforming, and other things are not gender conforming. And so you really have to think, is this a result of gender socialization or not? And there are many factors that are at play, as you know, in how people become emotionally intelligent or not. So we want to take these things all into account and know that gender is potentially a factor in EQ.
Yeah, and so not to leave you with the impression that we spend our time through a gender lens, but we hold that always as one of the lenses that we see the results through, but it's not necessarily an explicit conversation with a person. This is, I think, really what all of this is challenged for us and is helpful for us, that context matters in the EQI in terms of interpreting and understanding, and only the person really can do that. Having said that, because gender bias is such an unconscious bias, it's sometimes very helpful for us to make sure that we're using that as one of the ways that we understand the person's scores and help them understand their scores as well. So the interpretation and context are really important in these, and that you can't make gender assumptions, nor do you want to be gender blind when you're going in.
Absolutely. So we have time for a couple of quick questions, and then we'll wrap up. Anything at all that you'd like to know about that we can answer for you? So what are some typical questions, Jill, that we would get around these things?
Good question.
I know one is, how much can we actually change from how we were socialized? And I guess the answer to that question is based on our experience of we've seen people dramatically change when they become more aware of how they have either dismissed emotions because that it was just not something on their radar screen, or they encountered such contrary role models in their lives to being aware of and understanding emotions and paying attention to emotions.
Yeah, I think that for sure. We had a contract this past summer with 100 leaders EQI in a big grocer chain, and a lot of them scored lower on emotional self-awareness and self-expression, and a lot of them just were like, why? Like, and they set out to improve it because they were dedicated senior leaders, and it's really opened up a lot of opportunity and connection, and quite excited about their development. They were all quite excited about their own development in those areas. So I think, yeah, I don't know what my point is so much as, so we see that as something that gender conforms. Don't get trapped in that's a natural quality.
Yeah.
Stay in the perspective that all of these can be developed, and that there's such benefit for all people to be able to have opportunities to develop them.
So Kim has a great question. How do you sensitively raise the issue of gender bias, and how to raise such a defensive topic? Absolutely, it does become a defensive topic, right? If people are attached to their socialization, and again, I would want to ask you, Kim, about who are you raising it with? What is your objective and the purpose of raising it? So all those questions become important.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's it's why we're still in the feminist fight 40 years later, because people still feel like they need to defend it. And as a coach, I'm more curious about why they need to defend it than I am to get them to change their mind. I think so thank you for that. And I'm happy to have an offline conversation to follow up. It's a really good question. And then the other one was that gender may influence but doesn't have to define you, and that's really our point. Especially the EQI is one really powerful way in to help people see that these qualities don't define them, that they are contextual, they are movable, they are development oriented, and so I wonder if a team has a group really low self-expression, so you think it's an office culture. Again, I think these group reports are very interesting because they do reflect a culture. We just had the opportunity to be with 20 senior leaders, male and female, and the reports back from them is it's so changed the culture of their organization. So I think there's some real power in being able to build the muscles of some of these competencies.
And leadership and role modeling. And Michelle says, do you have EQ scores Indigenous? Yeah. Well, Jill and I have both worked extensively in Indigenous organizations. I think Jill has more experience with this idea of the matriarchal structure where female expression is highlighted.
Yeah, we actually have been very nervous to use the EQI in Indigenous communities. So that I'll just say that up front, because we're not sure that it's a helpful tool. You're always trying to weigh harms and helps against each other. But I think the content of what we're working with has been really helpful. So we've done that. We've taken our content, but not necessarily done the assessment.
We use the model.
It's a very, it's very Western. Even from my perspective, it doesn't always have a very good gender interpretation. So I set aside some of the computer generated comments and make up my own, because as any standard tool, there's going to be some gaps, and that's fine. But I think in Indigenous communities, gender is still, there's a high level of gender differentiation, even though they're historically matriarchal. There's a lot of violence against women in Indigenous communities as well. So there are still notions of male power within those. The chiefs are often, not always, men. So I'm not sure again, we can't pull out our cultural and colonization impact on Indigenous nations. So yeah,
Yeah.
again, I think where it works best is at the micro level of contact with people and how they can interpret it for themselves. Very complex and
Yeah.
nuanced. So we want to say we're sorry for taking such a nuanced topic.
And I wouldn't say never use the EQI with Indigenous organizations. I would say
we have never.
Use it very, very carefully.
Yeah, we have chosen not to.
We did once, it didn't. I did once, didn't go well. But in any case, tell you more about that one-to-one if you want to hear about that story. Okay.
Where there's significant gender disparities through. Yeah. Well, okay, so the idea of women treating women badly is also so true because we've all been socialized the same way.
Mm-hmm.
So we've all been socialized to treat women poorly. And so why
in fact, that UN study that just came out, 90% of the world's population are gender biased, and that's that UN study which just came out.
Yeah, and so I just say we've all been socialized the same. We all, that idea, keep your friends close and your enemies closer, like we're more tendency is to align with power, people in power, people who look more competent from our kind of stereotyped ways. And so, I worked in healthcare for 20 years and, nurses are notorious, but there's a very toxic gender patriarchal culture in most healthcare settings.
Yeah, it has a lot to do with power.
Yeah, has much more to do with power and the close association between power and gender.
Yeah. Aaron, it's a great question.
Yeah, male-dominated industry, typical for females to fight harder to gain success. Absolutely. And that's a perfect question, Aaron. Assuming there's more to it than honest, wanting to foster an empowered and equal workplace. Absolutely.
Yeah.
And so we think that the EQI, we love our leadership course. It's a 3-day intensive course. And really, like we've had this last round, men saying this has changed every aspect of their lives, and so much that they want their spouses to take the course because they're like, my spouse doesn't recognize me anymore. Like,
They actually got us to commit to creating a course for couples. So we'll be looking at that and coming up with something.
But it's true. I think that we can see, like, imagine in 3 days, if we can make that kind of significant change, move people, men in particular, from low emotional awareness and expression to high, and feeling more connected, collaborative, recognizing the critical aspects of emotional expression in organizations. And I think it's very powerful. So, Okay, how can we empower female employees in a safe and EI way without them assuming there's more to it than honest? Yeah, so Aaron's pointing to this kind of where is the line around harassment and unwanted or non-consensual. And, I think...
Or is it talking about affirmative action?
Well, wanting to, assuming there's more to it than an honest, without them assuming there's more to it than an honest wanting. So it could be all of those. So one of the things in coaching world is to design alliances, and I can't say it enough how important it is really to be explicit with everybody about what your motives are, and to live with those every step of the way. So you point to the qualities that you're wanting to develop. You're pointing to the qualities that make that candidate the one you're looking for. Again, senior leaders groups say more and more that they are not hiring for technical skills. They're hiring for emotional intelligence skills, and the technical skills can be developed. So the clearer you are in your hiring processes around what you're looking for and why you're looking for that, and what areas you're going to develop once they've been hired. So it's not, again, we're not hiring on gender, but we're hiring on qualities, and developing qualities. So yeah, it's tricky for men these days as well. We recognize that. But that's a good thing for men to be more aware of what consent actually means, and when social distancing is important, and not imposed, etc.
We are not role-playing social distancing here.
No, we are so not.
But we've also been isolated together.
For 2 weeks.
So what are your thoughts about how EQ is playing out today with COVID virus? you know, we think there's some fear and anxiety out there, and of course we know that one of the ways to sort of help with that is to connect with others. And so, you know, here we are trying to connect with all of you virtually, and we just so encourage people staying in touch.
Yeah, so we just wrote a blog. I'm not sure if it's up there yet, but we pointed to social responsibility. So thinking of others, not stockpiling, not fear buying, reaching out where you can safely to others to help other people. Empathy, again, thinking about other people. Flexibility, we are being asked right now to be very adaptive to what's going on, and no point in being resentful, because there's really nobody to be resentful to, yet people seem somehow resentful because they're being inconvenienced. So there's some good EQ skills that are really important right now.
Yeah.
And before we forget, we're having a networking meeting next week. Go on to our website.
Yeah, we're going to be having regular networking meetings throughout the time that we are socially isolated from each other, and probably continue on after that. And I hope you consider joining us. And yeah, 14 days of self-isolation. Resilience is important, absolutely.
Well, optimism, yeah, like
optimism.
Yeah, it's one of the things we talk about in our blog, is that optimism is closely associated with resilience, believing that, you know, we will get through this and that we'll bounce back. Doesn't mean it's it's not a silver lining or Pollyanna approach, but it's like, how much do we trust ourselves to be able to get through this? Optimism.
What can we do virtually to, you know, prepare, plan, be strategic for, you know, the time that this carries on, or the time that this ends, this pandemic, and so,
and what changes as a result of
that.
How does this point to all? One of the things I've been so aware of is all my relationships with people, you know, who looks after our condo building, who runs my Pilates studio, who, you know, like all the services that we all have in our lives, our grocery chain, and the people that, you know, we often say hi to or give a hug to that we can't right now. But how many people in my life look after my life with me? Our dog walkers, my chiropractor, like all the services that have shut down, and a deeper awareness of how important and kind of invisible some of those service people are in our lives. So again, developing gratitude and appreciation.
We have to wrap up.
We sure do.
And so
thanks for hanging in there, everyone.
So Pamela says, you know, will you be sending out invites or times for the networking events? Absolutely, Pamela. If you've registered for this event, we will definitely send you more details around that. And if you are ever feeling lonely and you want to reach out, you can talk to myself or Jill anytime. We just, you know, arrange a quick call via email. You know, we really appreciate you all showing up and for being here with us. So the networking meeting next week will be Zoom, so we'll actually have a little bit more face-to-face and be able to just talk among ourselves, so you won't have to just send in chat. And if we didn't get to your question, sorry, and we will take a look at all the questions and we'll respond by email for the ones that we were unable to get to. So thanks, everyone.
Yeah, thank you,
Take care.
everyone.
Have a great day. Stay safe. Yeah. Social distance. Bye for
physical distancing.
Bye for now. Okay, and end meeting.